right, my friends, before we talk about the lion's share for the Night of Lions of part 2 of the Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote today, in preparation for finishing it and doing a couple other things on Friday, let me talk about some changes to the schedule that will help to orient us appropriately. First and foremost, we're going to finish Don Quixote, not today, but on Friday. We have a couple final things that I think just need to be said on Friday, but the most essential things to say to you that will help you on your midterm essay, as well as to help you complete your understanding of Don Quixote, will be said today. In particular, we are talking about a couple passages that are preeminent parts to one of your prompt questions on the midterm essays. That said, the new prompts are uploaded to Moodle. We'll talk about them a little bit either Friday or Monday. A couple of them are very similar to prompts you saw on the Prelude paper. A couple are different. Don Quixote is still very much a part of that. So you are very much still being rewarded for your diligent study of this text beyond just the Prelude paper. All right. You may have noticed on the syllabus that there's a requirement that an outline be submitted prior to the second essay. We'll talk about that a little bit on Friday and Monday, what the conditions are that require an outline to be submitted to me. That said, if you were here on the day that we talked about how to outline and you wish to get ahead on your midterm essay, which is due in about 25 days or so, I think it's March 14th is when it's due, but do make sure to check that. It will very much help your writing to have an outline, particularly something I noticed in young writing is that it could be structurally improved. If simply the structure of the essay were made according to form, it would make its case in a much better sort of way. You might say that that's sort of like teaching you how to put on your earrings, your bracelets, and your shoes, not put your shoes on your hands and your gloves on your feet. That though you might have all the pieces that make for a good argument, that make for a good essay, it's not necessarily the case that you're putting them all together. There are also some elements that we're missing from essays that you will see on a more individual basis, but I'll address insofar as they become general after I've seen all of the essays themselves. But in general, I would say more students need to use a little bit more support from the text in their essays, and then also make sure to be citing the primary text and their citations. Some of these details that seem like small details are in fact important details. And so, well, do very much make sure that you don't just look at the grade for your essay without taking feedback, because it is more likely that your grade will go down as we progress if you do not take and integrate feedback that I give to you. Also, note that there are plenty of professors that give very limited feedback on writing, very hard to improve if that's done. Since I took the time and applied my skill to your work, you might take the time to try and improve your skill in order to improve your grade, which is in your interest and has very little benefit to me. Next, notes from underground. I had 2 lectures planned for that. I'm going to put them online because I don't think we have time for that. Also, go to Faust. I had 6 lectures planned for that. I think I'm going to do it in 3, and especially next week. So you may be wondering for pop quizzes what you need to have read through by Monday. By Monday, you need to have read through, in this edition, the Norton Critical Faust, page 113, Walpurgis Night, or Walpurgis Night. It looks like Walpurgis Night, if you are an English speaker. The German W makes a V sound. Okay, those are the notes that I have. Any questions about that before we roll into the lecture itself? All right, last time we got to around chapter 10 of Don Quixote. And there in chapter 10, we saw, interesting use of the word saw. We saw Sancho confronted with a dilemma. Recall that in part 1, he was tasked to find Dulcinea to give her a letter from Don Quixote. But A, he never took the letter from Don Quixote, B, he never made it to Dulcinea. And so now C, therefore C, he does not know where Dulcinea lives, nor necessarily what she looks like, though he had claimed that he knew who Aldonza Lorenza's daughter was and that he had seen her big forearms before from threshing wheat and such things. Confronted with 3 peasant women on Ginny's, Sancho then takes this opportunity to try and avoid a scolding and perhaps beating. Keep this in mind. Because of this lie, he will actually receive a beating that is about 3,300 times worse than what he could have expected, or at least he is supposed to. By the end of this lecture, if I've done my job correctly, you should understand that cryptic thing, which I have said. In any case, Sancho, knowing that his lord and master, Don Quixote, as he is described, is a little bit deluded, a little bit out of his mind, he claims that enchanters have turned Dulcinea into a peasant woman. And there's an exchange between them. Don Quixote cannot believe his eyes, literally cannot believe his eyes, which is sort of a funny sort of thing because generally he doesn't believe his eyes and makes up and alters circumstances that we would normally consider, or that we would consider sort of normal or normative, in order to suggest that he lives in chivalric romance. In this case, though he is confronted with what is called enchantment, he doesn't quite believe it, and it starts to shock him a little bit. In any case, the peasant women, eventually the one called Dulcinea, who's gotten off of her Ginny, jumps back on it in an athletic feat, and they roll off thinking that these are some noble gentlemen that are attempting to make fun of them. Quickly going through, we talked about the Knight of the Mirrors and the way in which the Knight of the Mirrors reflects Don Quixote. He is himself a person that is taking on the image of a chivalric knight, but he consciously knows that it is a fiction. He has also chosen a squire that is himself the neighbor of Sancho's squire, knowing that he is doing this in order to play a role, in order to play the role of a person who knows he is not a chivalric knight, but needs to be one in order to lure Don Quixote back to La Mancha. That said, when Sansón Carrasco, this bachelor that we met in the first 10 chapters, who's now donned knightly garb in order to return Don Quixote home, plotting alongside the priest and the barber, when he enters into combat with Don Quixote, he loses to him. He is felled. And so he will have to find another way to get Don Quixote back home. While doing this, Sancho has, or just before this, Sancho has a conversation with the squire of the Knight of the Mirrors, first the Knight of the Woods and then the Knight of the Mirrors, but we know him to be Sansón Carrasco. And so then notice also these layers of identity. His character, Sansón Carrasco, is known to be literate and intelligent because he is a bachelor from Salamanca, bachelor not as a single gentleman, but a person who has a bachelor's degree from an undergraduate university. We know that he has altered his identity to be a knight similarly to Don Quixote, but he has done so willingly rather than unwillingly. He is not driven crazy by what he has read, but rather is informed by what he has read in such a way as to be able to interact with Don Quixote in a, well, I'll say this tentatively, intelligent fashion. In any case, also just something kind of funny is that while reading a text, obviously one cannot see the characters one imagines and uses whatever details are given in order to imagine them. But details of disguise are especially interesting in written text. It turns out that Tomé Cecial has a large nose, prosthetic nose on his face, which scares Sancho, and in fact makes him climb a tree and not want to fight him. But the reason I mention this is that we have never met Tomé Cecial as a character. Even him being introduced, he is so new that we could not possibly recognize him. What is the point of him then having a disguise on so that we further can't recognize him? What is the purpose of a character being in disguise in a written text? And what is the difference between a character being in disguise in a written text and being in their true form in a work of fiction, which is literary? Is there even a true form of a literary character made of words and pieces of the imagination? Something else just to mention In this representation, it seems as if Sanson Carrasco takes being presenting himself as a chivalric knight a little bit more seriously than he will do later when he is the Knight of the White Moon. When he is the Knight of the White Moon, he will claim that he has a lady, but he won't give a name for her. She will become more generalized, abstract. In this case, however, he has clearly based the name of his lady on Dulcinea's name. He says that he has a lady named Casaldea de Vandalia, and that she is the most beautiful woman, or most beauteous woman in all of existence, that anybody who declares aught must be defeated in honorable combat. Well, Don Quixote defeats him and then says, you need to actually give up your lady Casaldea and claim that Dulcinea is the most beautiful. And so Sanson Carrasco's first attempt to rein Don Quixote's third sally in and bring him home is a failure. We then have a very curious episode, which reminds me quite a bit of the episodes from the first, very much from the first part, and that it is not scripted at all and involves no characters that have read the first part of Don Quixote, though we are coming up on those very soon. There is a gentleman who works for the king who has 2 lions that he is transporting. Don Quixote sees these lions and decides that he wants to enter into holy combat with them and to prove his strength. This lion tamer thinks that he's crazy, but agrees to open the cage for him. The lion is not forthcoming at first. It refuses to come out and engage with Don Quixote. So Don Quixote asks the lion tamer, will you go stir him up and get him out here, please? And the lion tamer says, no, absolutely not, because whoever stirs up this lion is going to be the one who is attacked by this lion. And actually, from what I know of knightly combat, all you have to do is challenge your opponent. If your opponent doesn't accept your challenge, then what can you do? You are victorious de facto. And so Don Quixote, in facing down the cowardly lion that refuses to attack him for whatever reason, finds himself having a second win in a row, basically, in terms of episodes. And because of this, Sancho no longer will call him the Knight of the Sorrowful Face, but the Knight of the Lions. So now, again, we see Don Quixote's identity. Alonso Quijana, maybe? Quijana, becoming then Don Quixote, becoming the Knight of the Sorrowful Face, becoming the Knight of the Lions. And then eventually we will see Alonso Quijano the Good. And so even with the suggestion that he is going to be Shepherd Quixotes at some point. We'll talk about that on the final lecture on Friday, when Don Quixote decides that he'll no longer be a knight. Instead, he'll be a shepherd, like Marcelo Grisostomo and so many of the other characters that we see, like Cardenio, Lucinda, Dorothea in particular. All right. I really need to jump into the Cave of Montesinos, chapters 22 and 23. But right before I do so, perhaps the most epic episode that involves marriage and subterfuge happens. It is the so-called episode of Camacho and Quiteria and Basilio. Apparently, this Basilio man had been sort of engaged to Quiteria, but had put off their engagement for a couple years in order to go make money. Sort of the perennial issue of being a young man in love. One, particularly in the early 17th century, one has to go make the money necessary to then support a family, particularly if one is going to get the blessing from the father, who will, of course, expect that his daughter be taken care of, and is partially judging the merits of the young man proposing to his daughter based on what sort of life they can give to her. Well, as much as Basilio loves Quiteria, and as hard as he starts to work in order to make the money necessary to provide the appropriate life for Quiteria, this Camacho comes about, rich Camacho. And from the wedding extravaganza that we witness, which is procession after procession after procession, even has a play with Cupid shooting an arrow into the heart of young lovers. We see that Camacho is extraordinarily wealthy. And so it's pretty tough. He's very much like a Don Fernando type, right? Well, so After the procession, and Don Quixote and Sancho watch the procession and are taken towards the wedding, and Sancho actually really loves the wedding of Camacho because it's got an open bar, so there's lots of food, lots to drink there, not just cheap water, as it were. At the wedding itself, while the vows are being made, Basilio interrupts. He interrupts and says, because Quiteria is his lawful wife, he can't, she shouldn't actually marry this Camacho. And that, he doesn't say she's his lawful wife, because she is actually promised to him she should not marry Camacho. And if she refuses to marry him then and there, he takes out a secret sword, puts it in the ground, and he impales himself. He's fallen, he's dying, he's bleeding. The priest goes over to him, who's officiating the wedding, and wants to tell him his final rites, his last rites. Now, something I need to tell you about the Catholic religion, which perhaps you know, is that one of the sacraments is to have final rites given over one's deathbed. This is something that was debated early on in part 1 of Don Quixote, where shepherds were saying, seems like the chivalric knights aren't very good Christians, because instead of exhorting God before they go into fight, they exhort their lady love. Seems sort of pagan. So here a very interesting conceit happens. Basilio says that he refuses to take his final rites, which are necessary for his entrance into heaven, until Quiteria do one last thing for him. Does anyone recall what that last thing was? It's a very interesting example of entrapment. He says, well, just marry me right before I die. Say the words, because I'll never be able to consummate it with you. I'm going to die in a minute or two due to loss of blood. What's the cost? You won't be divorced by the fact, I'm not divorcing you. I'll just simply die, and then you can remarry this Camacho guy. And actually, the priest and several people around think that's a pretty good idea. Don Quixote supports this idea as well. First, Quiteria is so shocked by this request that she doesn't know what to say. But the priest says, we need to make our decisions very quickly, because this man's about to die, and his blood, to some extent, will be on your hands, and his immortal soul, if you don't do this. So Quiteria decides to entertain this conceit. When saying their vows, Basilio makes sure that he and Quiteria say that no matter what happens, even if some miracle were to occur, where Basilio would live for several more years rather than die immediately, that Quiteria is entering willfully into marriage with him. She says this to him. And then, does he die? No, he jumps up. And turns out he had some red liquid in a tube. He didn't stab himself at all. He tricked everybody. But what is Quiteria going to say? And what is this crowd going to say? Well, Camacho's crowd pulls out their swords and they say this is illegitimate. But then an equal number of people take out their swords, fight on the behalf of Basilio, including Don Quixote. And so even though this woman, Quiteria, entered into this marriage thinking that the man she was going to marry would die immediately, it turns out that he had deceived them all. And though some in the crowd suggest that this is not an honest contract because deception was involved, there was an element of fraud, of course, Don Quixote says that all, essentially this paraphrase and cliche, all is fair in love and war, and that in love, deceit is fine if it has a noble end, which is questionable reasoning, but reasoning necessary to this moment, as it were. So this is really like, this is what Dorotea and Don Fernando, Lucinda and Cardenio, the story of the man who was recklessly curious, Leandra, Zoraida, and Eugenio, and all of these characters, all of this has been building up to this grand crescendo. And so Basilio, because of his gallant play acting, let's say, ends up with something very real that he wants. And so keep this in mind, the ontology of the situation. He constructs a sort of fraudulent situation in the middle of a very real holy situation, but ends up with a very holy sacrament between him and another woman as a as a result of his fraud. And so there's a real interplay between fiction and reality in this moment. And there seemed to be, this is something we've seen all along with the various beatings that Don Quixote and Sancho have received, that just because one is entertaining a fiction in reality does not mean that there will not be enduring consequences in one's reality. In fact, I would say a very sad example of this, the fiction of thinking and smoking cigarettes every day will not lead to something like mouth or lung cancer. It might not with you, but the stats suggest that something like well over 50% of long-term smokers develop such cancers. And so one can assume that those sorts of things will not happen to one, but can one intelligently assume that that fiction will not have a negative effect on one's reality? In any case, now we get to a true admixture of fiction and reality, and the reality of the text is what I mean here. Obviously, we're talking about things that are in some ways all fiction. The Cave of Montesinos. So Don Quixote very much enjoys the wedding of Camacho, or excuse me, we call it Camacho's wedding, though it is in fact Basilio who gets married to Quiteria. And because there's food and there's wine and there's general games going around. So as we know, Sancho is somebody who would very much like Mardi Gras and would have a good time during Mardi Gras, but wouldn't necessarily like to do the 10K before or after it. That said, Don Quixote has heard that there is a very curious cavern near here and enlists the help of a cousin of Basilio in order to go there. This cousin is himself a writer and wants to write several stories, including the Spanish Metamorphosis, and is himself interested in things like transformations. He leads Don Quixote to the Cave of Montesinos, where Don Quixote will have a rope fastened about his waist and will be let down into it like a spelunk. You may know that a spelunk is the word for cave in Latin. And so to spelunk is to be a caver who caves. Not the same as caving in, though that is itself based on the physical notion of cave. So Don Quixote goes down into this brambled cavern. It's down there for something like 30 minutes to an hour, according to Sancho. When he is brought back up, at first, there's a lot of slack in the line. And Sancho thinks, there's slack in the line, we must have lost him. The line may have been cut, and there's no longer the heavy object at the end of it. Oh my goodness, did we lose Don Quixote? But nope, they start to back up. Now, the things that I say from here on out regarding this episode are going to be essential, all essential, especially to your own writing. When Don Quixote is brought back up, his eyes are not open, they are closed. He tells a story of having been 3 days and 3 nights in the court of this character named Montesinos, himself cousin to a man named Durandarte, a famous chivalric knight, who asked him to rip out his heart with a knife after he died to give to the noble lady Palermo. While down in this cave, Don Quixote sees the figure of Merlin and also sees a figure of Dulcinea that he tells Sancho. And Sancho says, how did you know to recognize Dulcinea? Because remember that Sancho could not recognize Dulcinea. He could recognize the peasant woman that he claimed was the enchanted version of Dulcinea. The problem with that is that he has no image of what the actual Dulcinea looks like, whether she be a different peasant woman or just an image projected from Don Quixote's mind. Sancho doesn't. Don Quixote says he knew this woman because she was around her 2 attending women, and she looked just like him, was wearing the same clothing as the peasant had been wearing. And he actually yells to Dulcinea, please, noble lady, wait for me, but she turns from him. But one of her ladies in waiting comes to him and requests, and this is very strange given what we've heard about enchantment, she requests 6 reales, 6 pieces of money from Don Quixote in a very sort of realist, in a very highly surreal situation. He says, I don't actually have 6 reales, I have 4 reales, so will she accept that? The lady in waiting takes them from him, which is an interesting sort of thing. So now we see, again, Don Quixote, who did not even carry money in part 1 in order to pay innkeepers, to call them castle owners or castellans, I guess, now has money that he had borrowed from Sancho in order to give alms to the poor that he now passes on to this lady. A question I might really ask if I were you is, can he pat himself down after he comes out of the Cave of Montesinos and see whether he still has the money or not? That might help to establish whether this is a real circumstance or not. But we are denied that conceit. Like the video game where if only you could go jump 1 foot up, you could get to the next area, and yet you have to follow this path that's prescribed for you, and you can't do that. Perhaps that's like education. As Don Quixote tells this story to Sancho, these next two parts are essential for understanding the situation, though there are more details to come that are just essential. Sancho claims he does not believe the story at all. This goes back to what we started with. If I tell you something which is inaccurate, but I don't mean to lie, what have I said to you? It doesn't seem that I've lied to you, but I also haven't told you the honest truth. What is the status of the thing that I've said? And so the cousin asks Sancho, you surely don't think that Don Quixote, your Lord and Master, is lying to you. What would it stand to gain from lying to both of us? And Sancho says, I don't think he is lying. I don't think that he's telling the truth either. And so this is interesting because it seems like Sancho now, and we've seen a couple of examples of this with him claiming that Dulcinea is enchanted, and now seeing that part of what he said to Don Quixote is now part of one of his delusions when he goes down for 30 minutes, thinks that it's been 3 days in this Cave of Montesinos. He seems now to be developing more of a perspective on Don Quixote that, say, the characters in the second part have on Don Quixote who have read the first part. Seems to understand to some extent the nature of Don Quixote's madness, or at least to understand it well enough to know that that which he says is not guaranteed true. And so Sancho's understanding of his master is here developing. He does not seem to simply think that Don Quixote is, he certainly doesn't think that he's in his right mind, but he seems perhaps to think that he's out of his mind in a way that can lead to Sancho's own advantage. So more on that in a moment. Now, perhaps even more importantly, I don't even know if I have a note written here, but I should. A character that doesn't pipe up very often pipes up. An extremely rare character that's been with us all along the way. The translator. This is not the narrator. This is not Cid Hamete Benengeli, the writer of the history, but the translator of Cid Hamete Benengeli's true Arabic history into Spanish. This translator had apparently written a marginal note after this. This is wonderful. As a medievalist like me, something that you find in like old Bibles and old texts are that often the scribes have written notes like, oh, this is a corruption, or you should read this like this, or I don't think this is true, or here's some quote from Plato. And these are called marginalia. And a question, you have like, say, a 13th century manuscript that has some famous monks' writings along the sides of it is, do you include the marginalia alongside the text itself? And so at first, obviously, you think, no, it's marginalia. It's like notes. But these are old, perhaps helpful notes at this point. And if a text has been around for 700 years with these marginalia, are they not part of the text itself? This is part of the question of identity and transformation. In any case, these marginalia written by this translator about the Cave of Montesinos make this claim. Listen very closely. The details of it. Read it over and over again, especially if you're going to use it. I believe it's right at the end of chapter 23, might be at the beginning of chapter 24. In fact, if I can find it in about 5 seconds, I probably can't, I'm going to read it to you because it is, in fact, very, very, very helpful. Second part, let's see, 15, 18, 20, 22, 23. Let's go. The man who translated this great history from the original, this page 614, right at the beginning of chapter 24 in our edition. The man who translated this great history from the original, composed by its first author, Cid Hamete Benengeli, says that when he reached the chapter concerning the adventure of the Cave of Montesinos, he found in the margin written in Hamete's own hand these precise words. Okay, see, the translator is here taking a moment to tell us what Cid Hamete has written in the margins beyond the actual history itself. So Cid Hamete Benengeli, excuse my error earlier, has made an additional note suggesting his own perspective, and the translator brings this alive to us. Remember, not the narrator. This is what Cid Hamete Benengeli says. I cannot believe, nor can I persuade myself, that everything written in the preceding chapter actually happened in its entirety to the valiant Don Quixote. The reason is that all the adventures up to this point have been possible and plausible, but with regard to this one in the cave, I can find no way to consider it true, since it goes so far beyond the limits of reason. But it is not possible for me to think that Don Quixote, the truest and most noble knight of his day, would lie, here like Sancho, or he would not tell a lie, even if he were shot by or shot with arrows. Moreover, he recounted and told in all its circumstances and details. In so short a time, he could not fabricate so enormous a quantity of nonsense. If this adventure seems apocryphal, the fault is not mine. You understand the difference between canon and apocrypha. This is a biblical sort of tradition. That which is canon is that which is chosen to actually be in the Bible. That which is apocryphal, you often see this in Protestant Bibles. The apocrypha are included, or the pseudepigrapha. These are the works that are regard the same content, but are not considered legitimate or spurious in some way. And so apocryphal tales are tales that are maybe true, maybe not, like the tale of George Washington and the cherry tree, very much an apocryphal tale, certainly not a canonical tale. Though it has made it into the canon, it's certainly not true. Moreover, he recounted and told in all its circumstances and details, blah, blah, blah. If this adventure seems so apocryphal, the fault is not mine, and so without affirming either its falsity or its truth, I write it down. You, reader, address, since you are a discerning person, you'll see, must judge it according to your own lights, for I must not and cannot do more, yet it is considered true. Now this is essential. And yet it is considered true that at the time of Don Quixote's passing in death, he is said to have retracted it. He issued a retraction, saying he had invented it because he thought it was consonant and compatible with the adventures he had read in his histories. You really need to look at the grammar of that last sentence. Close to the book, just a little bit in advance. Note whether Cid Hamete Benengeli was a first-hand witness. Yet it is considered true that at the time of Don Quixote's passing in death, he is said to have retracted it, saying he had invented it. Did Cid Hamete Benengeli witness this himself? No. How does he know that this was? How does he know that this was true? This is like talking to your friend about something that happened, and important to know the differences here. What is the basis of Cid Hamete's knowledge here? How did he acquire the knowledge about Don Quixote, he says? This is important for asking your friends when they tell you something that you find galling. He is said to have retracted. He must have heard this story from someone else. He does not have himself direct experience of it. So even though this is the writer of the tale writing in marginalia, suggesting the Cave of Montesinos could not have been real because he doesn't think it's possible, and in fact he heard that Don Quixote on his deathbed renounced or retracted this, it's still the case that he heard that Don Quixote did this. And so is this in fact the truth? There is room for doubt. Were this a courtroom, and I, a lawyer, trying to convince you, the jury, that this person was not giving the truth, I would harp on this over and over and over again. What you heard from someone, you heard, how do you verify that that's true? And so this is part of the further confusing of reality and fiction within the overarching fiction itself. I'm glad that I got to read it to you. Page 614, keep that in mind. All right. A couple very important things happen that I'm going to have to skip over very quickly. We meet the puppet master and the prophetic monkey. One thing I'll say about this is we find another character in disguise. Inés de Pasamonte has now taken on himself a new name. Remember that there was some difficulty with his name too. He was being called Hennessio in the first 10 chapter or the first 25 chapters or so of the first part. But now he's Hines. He is the galley slave who, like Hannibal Lecter, was extremely wrapped up and had written his own autobiography, though he hadn't completed it because his life wasn't over. Now he has a puppet show and has taken on a new name. His name is now Master Pedro. Something interesting about this, recall that Don Quixote had seen a procession of traveling actors and had accepted from them, even though they were in such costumes as the figure of death, that they were in fact actors. And were not knights and a procession of death that he needed to fight against. Well, that might make one expect that Don Quixote can tell the difference between illusion and reality, or at least the difference between that which is a performance in front of him and that which is actually happening. Like the difference between seeing somebody getting punked and somebody seeing, all know that old Ashton Kutcher show where celebrities would be put in situations and they would end up freaking out because something terrible was happening to them, and Ashton Kutcher would show up and hug them and be like, "Ha, you got punked." It'd be something terrible, like somebody's like, we're foreclosing on your house. This person's like, "I'm a millionaire. What do you mean foreclosing on my house?" And so they would get into that sort of thing. That's it. Don Quixote here, while watching a puppet show, which portrays a fight between Moors and Christians, then decides that this is a real fight, takes out his weapon, and destroys many of the puppets in front of him. Master Pedro says, "Oh, this is my livelihood. What have you done?" And they then, in a moment of triumphant realism, following a moment of extreme surrealism, then go through how much each of the puppets must have cost, so that Don Quixote can have Sancho pay the man. But again, note that we are introduced to a new character who is himself a character in disguise from the first part. What is the difference between this being simply a new character and being a character in disguise? What does it add to the story that we find out at the very end of this episode that this Master Pedro is in fact Hines de Pasamonte from part 1? I think something just to help you to see what light is there is that this is part of what makes this a masterful text. Elements from the beginning are being brought back into the end. Things, many of the threads that are cast out into the wind are now returning at the end of this text. All right, there's then the adventure of the water wheels. You all know about a water wheel. It's used for milling, generally for crushing grain. And if you were to get sucked into a water wheel, it would be a very bad moment for you. In any case, Don Quixote almost does. He wants to attack it. It's very much like attacking a windmill. It's the sort of thing that can crush and destroy you, and it does destroy his ship. After that, however, he sees a noble man hawking. To be hawking is certainly a noble bit of recreation, like hunting as well, or to engage in archery, particularly in the 17th century. So this is a man of high stature. In fact, it turns out that he is a duke, and he is out, and he has read the first part of Don Quixote, and he loves Don Quixote. He very much likes him. And in fact, he would love for Don Quixote to come stay at his house. Now, one thing about this is that because he is of the leisure class, this duke and his lady Duchess, they're not involved in any wars right now. They don't have a lot going on, and they have a full, highly literate staff of pages and individuals at their service. And so what they construct is sort of a bizarro house or a fun house within their own manner. What do I mean by that? They create a situation in which Don Quixote is, each servant is commanded to treat Don Quixote as if he is in fact a chivalric. They create a situation in which fiction and reality blend. They do this in order to create their own Cave of Montesinos-esque phantasmagoric procession out during a hunt with Don Quixote. A hunt where Don Quixote and Sancho will be put on a wooden horse called Clavileño that has fireworks inside of it and will be blasted off above the sphere of the heaven in order to see the constellations. During this procession, Don Quixote is supposed to see Merlin, and Merlin will give him information about how to disenchant Dulcinea. And how he will tell Don Quixote that he will disenchant Dulcinea is by Sancho receiving 3,300 lashes on the back. So think about this. The reason that Sancho will receive 3,300 lashes on the back is to disenchant Dulcinea. How did the Duke and Duchess know that Dulcinea has been enchanted? They don't know this from reading part 1. This happened in part 2 in chapter 10. We know that Don Quixote saw Dulcinea in the Cave of Montesinos. And then we know that Sancho, move to the next one of these. We know that Sancho sits down and has a conversation with the Duchess. And in this conversation, he admits some things. I hold my master Don Quixote to be stark mad. It is my firm belief he is cracked. I can venture to make him believe things that have neither head nor tail, like that affair of the answer to the letter, the affair of the enchantment of my lady Dulcinea, for I made him believe that he is enchanted, though there's no more truth in it than over the fields of Oviedo. Complicating that, however, the Duchess then responds to him that Sancho, though he fancies himself the deceiver, is the one that is deceived. And that there's no more reason to doubt the truth of this than of anything else we never saw. Senor Sancho Panza must know that we too have enchanters here. This is the Duchess speaking to Sancho, correcting him here, that are well disposed to us and tell us what goes on in the world plainly and distinctly without subterfuge or deception. And believe me, Sancho, that agile country lass was and is Dulcinea del Toboso, who is as much enchanted as the mother who bore her. So the Duchess has now heard of Sancho's fiction, claiming that the lass that he saw in chapter 10 was peasant, was Dulcinea. In hearing that, she then claims to him, creating her own fiction, no, that was actually Dulcinea. Even though you think you were lying and making something else, that was actually her. And it was the enchanters here who did that. She then tells the court page who is constructing the fictional situation or the hunt situation that Don Quixote will go on to integrate this piece of knowledge into this hunt, so that when Don Quixote and Sancho go on the hunt, ride on Clavileño and hear from Merlin that in fact it is the case that Dulcinea really is enchanted. And because she's enchanted, it's not Don Quixote that has to pay the price, but Sancho. We see some element of poetic justice here, because who is the person in the first place in part 2 who claimed that Dulcinea was enchanted in order to avoid a beating? Sancho. How does that come back to bite him in the rear? Well, comes back with 3,300 force. That said, Sancho is a very clever sort of individual, and I'm sure that he will find a way to avoid this. All right, in our next class, I'll talk a little bit about the Countess Trifaldi, Altisidora, and the final days of Don Quixote.